Imagine finding a city buried under the ground, a city with streets, homes, drainage pipes, and public wells, all of it organized so perfectly that even modern town planners would be impressed. Now imagine that this city was built over 4,000 years ago, long before anyone thought humans were capable of doing something like that. No one knew it existed. No one taught it in schools. And then one day, someone dug into the ground and found it. That is not a story from a movie. That actually happened, and it happened more than once. Now think about what it means that we did not know about it. Not for a year, not for a decade, centuries, sometimes for thousands of years. These civilizations were simply missing from the version of history that most people learned. Their cities were buried under the ground, their monuments were buried under jungle, their records were locked in scripts that nobody could read, and the people who came after them either forgot them entirely or, in some cases, deliberately chose not to include them in the story of human achievement. When we do finally discover them, through digging, through aerial photography, through chemical analysis of ancient bones, through the decoding of ancient texts, what we find again and again is the same thing. These were not primitive people stumbling through a dark world. These were intelligent, organized, creative human beings building remarkable things. We have been told a version of history that says human beings slowly got smarter over time. That ancient people were simple. That they lived in caves, hunted animals, and only figured things out very recently. But the more we dig into the ground literally, the more we find that this story is wrong, dead wrong. The civilizations we're about to talk about were not primitive. They were not lucky. They were not stumbling around in the dark. They had systems. They had planning. They had knowledge that took real intelligence, real effort, and real time to build. And in some cases, they had figured out things that we only recently began to understand ourselves. Here is what is going to blow your mind. Most of these civilizations were forgotten not because they failed, but because history buried them. Political reasons, natural disasters, time, and in some cases, the people who came after them simply could not understand what they were looking at, so they ignored it. By the time we finish going through all 10 of these civilizations, you are going to see the ancient world in a completely new way. Not as a place full of simple people barely surviving, but as a place full of brilliant human beings who were solving real problems in ways that were ahead of their time. Let us start. Most people, when they think about ancient civilizations, think about Egypt or Greece or Rome, but there was a civilization that was bigger than both Egypt and Mesopotamia combined, and almost nobody talks about it. It was called the Indus Valley Civilization. It existed in what is now Pakistan and northwestern India. At its height, around 4,000 years ago, it had cities with populations of tens of thousands of people. And we are not talking about random collections of mud huts. We are talking about carefully planned, organized, and engineered cities that show a level of thinking that researchers today are still trying to fully understand. Here's what was found when archaeologists started digging up the city of Mohenjo-Daro, one of the largest cities of this civilization. The streets ran in a grid, not sort of a grid, not approximately a grid, a real, measured grid, where roads crossed at right angles, just like the blocks you see in modern cities like New York or Chicago. The people who built this city did not do that by accident. They had to plan it. They had to measure it. They had to decide how wide each road would be and where each road would go before a single brick was laid. Now here's where it gets even more interesting. Underneath those streets were drains, underground drainage pipes running through the entire city, carrying wastewater away from homes and into larger collection channels. This is a sewage system, a real, working sewage system. And it was built in a city that existed roughly 4,000 years ago. For comparison, most cities in medieval Europe, which came thousands of years later, had no sewage system at all. People threw waste into the streets. Disease spread constantly. The average life in those cities was genuinely miserable because no one had solved the basic problem of where human waste should go. The Indus Valley people had already solved it. Before the Roman Empire existed, before the Greek philosophers had started writing, before Europe had even developed into recognizable nations. The homes in Mohenjo-Daro also had something remarkable. Bathrooms. Not symbolic bathrooms. Not ceremonial rooms. Actual bathrooms connected to the drainage system, with brick floors designed to channel water out of the home. Some homes had their own private wells. The city also had large public wells that were accessible to everyone. Think about what this tells us. This was not a society where few powerful people lived in luxury while everyone else suffered. Public wells suggest that clean water access was something the city wanted to provide for all its people. That is a public health concept. That is civic planning. That is governance. The weights and measurements found in Indus Valley cities are another piece of evidence that these people were more advanced than we give them credit for. Researchers found small, precisely carved stone weights in multiple cities across the region. And here's the thing, the weights match. The standard of measurement was the same in cities that were hundreds of miles apart. That means there was trade. That means there was communication. That means there was a shared system of measurement that multiple cities agreed to use, which required some form of coordination and agreement across a wide. We still have not fully decoded the Indus Valley script, the writing system they used. Over 4,000 symbols have been identified, and despite many attempts by researchers around the world, no one has completely cracked it yet. That is not because the writing is simple. It is because it is complex, and the language it records has no clear connection to anything else we know well. What we do know is that this civilization lasted for nearly 1,000 years. It did not collapse quickly. It did not fall apart after a couple of generations. It endured for centuries, which means the systems it built were not just clever. They were durable. They worked well enough to sustain hundreds of thousands of people across a vast area for a very long time. There is something else worth saying about the Indus Valley civilization that does not get enough attention: the scale of it. This was not a city or two. At its greatest extent, the Indus Valley civilization covered an area of about 1 million square kilometers, roughly the size of the entire Indian subcontinent from the Himalayas down to central India. Over 1,000 settlement sites have been identified by archaeologists across this region. The civilization had multiple large cities, Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa being the two most famous, along with hundreds of smaller towns and villages. For all of this to function, there had to be communication. There had to be administration. There had to be shared standards, shared agreements, shared rules, and yet we have found no evidence of a massive palace complex suggesting a single all-powerful ruler. We have found no evidence of huge armies or large-scale warfare during the civilization's main period. The Indus Valley civilization appears to have been organized, administered, and maintained without the domination systems. The empires built by conquest, the massive armies, the god kings that we associate with other ancient civilizations of similar scale. How a society of hundreds of thousands of people across 1 million square kilometers maintained cohesion, shared standard, and functional governance without those domination structures is a question that historians and archaeologists are still genuinely struggling to answer. The answer, when we eventually find it, may tell us something important not just about the past, but about what is possible for organized human societies. When it finally declined, researchers believe it was likely due to major changes in river patterns and climate shifts that affected agriculture. The rivers that fed their cities may have moved or dried up. The rains may have become unreliable. They were not undone by stupidity or chaos. They were undone, it seems, by forces of nature that no amount of planning could fully overcome. Most people have heard of ancient Greece. Far fewer have heard of the civilization that came before it, right there in the same part of the world that in many ways was more sophisticated than early Greek society. That civilization was the Minoans, and they lived on the island of Crete. The Minoans were at their peak roughly between 4,000 and 3,500 years ago, and the discoveries made at their palace complexes, particularly at a place called Knossos, forced researchers to completely rethink what Bronze Age people were capable of. The palace in Knossos was enormous. Not enormous for its time, enormous by any measure. It had multiple stories. It had hundreds of rooms. It had corridors and storage areas and ceremonial halls. And it had something that stopped archaeologists cold when they first discovered it in the early 1900s: indoor plumbing. We are talking about clay pipes running through the walls and under the floors, carrying fresh water in and wastewater out. The pipes were designed with tapered ends, meaning each piece fit into the next, creating a sealed connection. This design actually used the pressure of flowing water to keep the system moving, which is a genuine engineering concept. People who designed these pipes understood how water flows through enclosed spaces. There were flush toilets in the palace at Knossos. Not flush toilets in the modern sense, but seats connected to channels where water could be poured to wash waste away. The toilet waste went into the pipe system and out of the building. This is sanitation engineering. This is the kind of thinking that protects people from disease by keeping waste away from living spaces and water sources. The Minoans also had light wells built into their palace. These were open shafts in the middle of the building to let sunlight and fresh air reach interior rooms. In a building with hundreds of rooms, natural light and ventilation are serious problems. If you do not solve them, the interior of the building becomes dark, hot, and stuffy. Minoans solved it by building air circulation directly into the structure. Their art gives us a picture of a society that was, by the standards of its time, unusually equal between men and women. Minoan wall paintings, which are vivid and detailed and still stunning to look at, show women in active central roles. Women are shown participating in what appear to be athletic and ceremonial events. The fashion depicted in the art shows both men and women dressed in elaborate, sophisticated clothing. This was not a society where half the population was invisible or there are famous images from Minoan art of people leaping over bulls, a practice that researchers believe was a real athletic or ceremonial event. The figures shown leaping are both male and female, depicted with equal grace and skill. Whether bull leaping was sport or ceremony or something else entirely, the fact that it appears repeatedly in Minoan art shown as a shared activity across gender lines tells us something about how Minoan society viewed the role of women compared to many other ancient cultures. The Minoans were also skilled craftspeople. Their pottery is distinctive, elegant, thin-walled, decorated with marine life images like octopuses, fish, and sea plants. Quality of Minoan craft goods was high enough that they were exported across the Mediterranean as luxury items. Egyptian wall paintings have been found showing figures who appear to be Minoans bringing gifts, suggesting that the two cultures were in active contact and that Minoan craftsmanship was valued highly enough to serve as diplomatic and trade goods at the highest levels. The writing system of the Minoans is another myth. Two different scripts have been found at Minoan sites. The earlier one, called Cretan hieroglyphics, is still undecoded. The later one, called Linear A, is also still undecoded. Later script found at Mycenaean Greek sites called Linear B was decoded in the 1950s and found to be an early form of Greek. Linear B appears to have been adapted from Linear A. This means the writing system of the later Greeks may have had its roots in a Minoan script. Another example of how Minoan cultural influence extended beyond their own civilization's lifespan. The Minoans were also traders. Their pottery, their art, their crafts have been found all across the Mediterranean, in Egypt, in mainland Greece, in what is now Turkey and the Middle East. They were connected to the wider world. They had a merchant class. They had ships capable of crossing open water. They built wealth not just through farming, but through commerce. And then, around 3,500 years ago, something happened. The details are still debated. A massive volcanic eruption on the nearby island of Thera, now called Santorini, sent huge amounts of debris into the atmosphere and may have triggered tsunamis that struck the Minoan coastline. Whether the eruption alone destroyed the Minoan civilization or whether other factors like invasion and trade disruption played a role is something researchers still argue about. What is not debated is this: the Minoans left behind evidence of a society that was thoughtful, organized, artistic, and technically capable in ways that challenge the assumption that sophisticated living is a recent invention. In 1994, a Kurdish shepherd in southeastern Turkey was walking through a hillside when he kicked something hard sticking out of the ground. What he had found would turn the story of human history completely upside down. What was beneath that hill was Göbekli Tepe, a massive, organized complex of carved stone pillars arranged in circles, buried under the ground, and built by human beings roughly 12,000 years ago. 12,000 years? Let that sink in for a moment. The pyramids of Egypt are about 4,500 years old. That is considered extremely ancient. Göbekli Tepe is more than twice as old as the pyramids. It was built roughly 6,000 years before writing was invented anywhere in the world. It was built roughly 7,000 years before Stonehenge, and what was built there was not simple. The stone pillars at Göbekli Tepe are tall. Some of them are over 5 meters high and weigh more than 10 tons. They were shaped not just roughly chipped into a column shape, shaped with detail. Many of them have carved animals on them: foxes, snakes, birds, spiders, wild boars, and other creatures, all carved with skill and intention. Some of the pillars have what appear to be human arms and hands carved onto their sides, suggesting the pillars themselves were meant to represent human or human-like figures. The circles of pillars were not random, they were arranged deliberately. Placement shows knowledge of geometry, the ability to lay out a circle and position large stones within it in a planned way. Moving those stones from their quarry sites, which researchers have identified nearby, required organized group effort. It required tools. It required leadership and coordination. It required planning over time. The images carved on the pillars at Göbekli Tepe are also worth pausing on. They are not random scribbles. They are composed, intentional images of real animals, rendered with accuracy and skill. A vulture spreading its wings, a scorpion in detail, a wild boar in motion. These images required the carver to have observed these animals carefully, to have understood their forms well enough to reproduce them in stone with fidelity. This is the product of a mind that notices things, that pays close attention to the world, that values accuracy in representation. That is the same quality of mind that drives scientific observation and artistic achievement today. There is a theory proposed by some researchers that the carvings at Göbekli Tepe may record specific astronomical events, that certain animal images correspond to constellations as seen in the night sky 12,000 years ago. If this interpretation holds up under further scrutiny, it would mean the builders of Göbekli Tepe were not just carving animals they liked, they were mapping the sky in stone, creating a permanent record of celestial knowledge. This is still being studied and debated, but the fact that it is a serious academic proposition says something about the level of sophistication researchers believe these people possessed. Here is what made this discovery so shocking to the scientific world. At the time Göbekli Tepe was built, human beings were not supposed to be capable of this. The widely accepted understanding of history said that large-scale organized construction only became possible after people settled down into farming communities, which happened around 10,000 years ago. The logic was, farming creates food surplus. Food surplus allows some people to stop farming and do other things like construction, and that specialization is what allows big projects to happen. But Göbekli Tepe was built before farming was established in that region. People who built it were, as far as we can tell, still largely hunter-gatherers. They hunted wild animals and gathered wild plants. They did not yet have the food surplus system that was supposed to be required for big construction projects. This completely flipped the standard model. Suddenly, researchers had to ask, what if the relationship between farming and construction goes the other way? What if people who were capable of organized construction, people with enough social organization to gather in large numbers and work toward a common goal, were the same people who then figured out farming? What if the ability to cooperate at a large scale came first and agriculture followed? That is a massive rethinking of human development. It all came from a shepherd kicking a rock on a hillside in Turkey. The site also shows evidence of large communal feasting. Enormous amounts of animal bones have been found there, suggesting that people gathered at Göbekli Tepe in large numbers for events that involved shared meals. This was a meeting place, a gathering site. Okay, perhaps a ceremonial center that drew people from across a wide region. Only a small portion of Göbekli Tepe has been excavated so far. Ground scanning technology has revealed that there are many more structures still buried beneath the hill. What else is down there is still being uncovered, and each new season of excavation tends to produce something that surprises even the researchers who have dedicated their careers to studying it. There is another detail about Göbekli Tepe that is worth pausing on. After the complex was built and used, it was deliberately buried. Not buried by time, not buried by flood or earthquake. Buried intentionally. The builders or people who came after them filled in the structures with soil and debris, covering them completely. This was a choice someone made. Why? We do not know for certain. But the deliberate burial suggests that whatever purpose the site served, people of the time considered it important enough to preserve, to seal it carefully rather than simply abandon it. This is a ritual act. This is an intentional act of preservation or closure. This is evidence of a relationship to the past and to built space that shows complex, meaningful thinking about what places and structures mean. Göbekli Tepe has forced a fundamental rethinking of what our ancestors were capable of. It has pushed back the timeline for large-scale organized human activity by thousands of years. It has shown that the impulse to build something monumental, to gather in large groups for shared purposes, to mark important moments with permanent structures. That impulse is not recent. It is ancient, deep, and apparently built into the very nature of what human beings do when they come together. This one is unusual because we know about it mainly through the records of another civilization, ancient Egypt. Egyptians mentioned a place they called Punt many times over thousands of years of recorded history. They described it as a wealthy, distant land full of resources, gold, ebony wood, myrrh trees, animal skins, live animals, and more. They sent trading expeditions there. They brought back enormous quantities of goods. They described it with what reads in their records almost as reverence, a special place they called God's Land. For a long time, historians thought Punt might be a myth or an exaggeration, a legendary land that the Egyptians invented to explain the origins of luxury goods. But then the physical evidence started piling up. Actual Punt goods have been identified in Egyptian archaeological sites. Dried baboon remains found in ancient Egyptian context have had their DNA analyzed, and that analysis points to an origin in a specific part of Africa, the region that is now roughly Ethiopia, Eritrea, and Somalia. A mummified baboon from the New Kingdom period of Egypt was analyzed, and the chemical makeup of its bones pointed to the same geographic region. Myrrh trees, which the Egyptians brought back from Punt and apparently tried to transplant to Egypt, as recorded in the Temple of the Pharaoh Hatshepsut, where a famous expedition is depicted in detailed wall carvings, are native to that Horn of Africa region. The temple carvings from the expedition sent by Hatshepsut around 1470 BCE are remarkable. They show the leader of Punt, a man, standing with his wife, who was depicted as a large woman. Show Punt's landscape, trees, water, buildings on stilts, which is a style of construction still used in parts of East Africa today. They show the loading of ships with goods. They show the people of Punt in detail. What this tells us is that there was an established civilization in that region that the Egyptians recognized as an organized, wealthy society worth trading with over a period of at least 1,000 years. Punt was not a primitive village. It had enough organization and production to supply Egypt repeatedly with high-value goods. It had enough political structure for Egypt to treat it as a legitimate trading partner with recognizable leaders. The reason Punt is fascinating is not just what it was, but what it tells us about the ancient trading world. Long before people believed long-distance sea trade was possible, there were ships sailing from Egypt down the Red Sea, across open water, and reaching the East African coast. That is navigation. That is shipbuilding capable of open water voyages. That is a network of trade connecting civilizations across hundreds and hundreds of miles of sea. The civilization of Punt itself has never been directly excavated, as no one has yet confirmed its exact location with the kind of certainty needed for a major dig. But the weight of evidence strongly points to a real, substantial, organized society that existed on the Horn of Africa and was connected to the wider ancient world in ways we are only beginning to fully document. What the story of Punt also tells us, beyond what it says about Punt itself, is that the ancient world was far more connected than we typically imagine. There was no moment in history where the world was divided into isolated pockets of civilization that had no knowledge of each other. Trade, contact, and exchange were happening across enormous distances for thousands of years before anyone in Europe thought to write it down. The Red Sea was not a barrier, it was a highway. Ships had been moving goods, people, and ideas across it for millennia. Punt is just one node in a network of exchange that connected Africa, Arabia, India, and the Mediterranean world into something that functioned its own ancient way as a global economy. Still in Africa. Because Africa has far more ancient history than it is typically given credit for, we come to the Kingdom of Aksum. This was a civilization centered in what is now northern Ethiopia and Eritrea, and it reached its height roughly between the 1st and 7th centuries of the Common Era. Aksum was not a small or local power. It was one of the great powers of its time. A Roman envoy writing in the 3rd century described the world's 4 great kingdoms as Rome, Persia, China, and Aksum. That is not a fringe opinion or an exaggeration. That is a Roman diplomat placing an African kingdom on equal footing with the Roman Empire itself. Aksum sat at the crossroads of major ancient trade routes. Goods moving between the Roman Empire, the Arabian Peninsula, India, and sub-Saharan Africa often passed through Aksum, or through the port of Indus on the Red Sea coast, which Aksum controlled. The kingdom accumulated enormous wealth from this trade. It minted its own gold coins, one of only a handful of ancient civilizations to do so. Having your own coinage is not a trivial achievement. It means you have a stable enough economy and strong enough central authority to issue, control, and guarantee the value of currency. The coins are remarkable in themselves. Some of them carry the names and portraits of Aksumite kings, and some are inscribed with symbols that changed over time, including, eventually, the cross, marking Aksum's adoption of Christianity in the 4th century, making it one of the earliest states in world history to adopt Christianity as an official religion. But what most people find jaw-dropping when they first encounter Aksum are the stelae. These are tall carved stone towers, monolithic columns carved from single pieces of stone, some of which are among the tallest stone structures ever built in the ancient world. The largest one that still stands today is roughly 24 meters tall. There was once a larger one, the Great Stela, that was estimated at over 30 meters and over 500 tons. It fell at some point in antiquity and lies broken on the ground, carving a single piece of stone into a tall, detailed tower shape, moving that stone to its intended site, raising it upright so it stands on its own. These are engineering challenges that require serious understanding of physics, serious organizational capacity, and serious tools. The Aksumites were doing this while also running a sophisticated international trading economy and minting gold coins. Their buildings were also notable, multi-story stone structures with alternating courses of wood and stone in their walls. This construction style, sometimes called the Aksumite style, is distinctive and has been found by researchers to have structural advantages, particularly in regions prone to earthquakes. Whether this was intentional earthquake resistance design or a technique that happened to provide that benefit is debated, but the technique itself shows architectural knowledge and skill. Aksum eventually declined, likely due to a combination of shifts in trade routes, partly caused by the rise of Islam in Arabia, which redirected some of the regional commerce and environmental changes that affected the agricultural base of the kingdom. But at its peak, it was one of the most powerful, wealthy, and sophisticated states in the world. One more thing about Aksum deserves to be said. It was literate. The Aksumites had their own writing system, Ge'ez script, which is still in use today as the script for the Amharic and Tigrinya languages spoken in Ethiopia and Eritrea. This is a writing tradition that has been unbroken for over 2,000 years. Unlike the undecoded scripts of the Indus Valley or the Minoans, the writing of Aksum can be read. Its records survive. Its history is documented in its own words, and those records tell of a civilization that was self-aware, administratively sophisticated, internationally engaged, and intellectually active. The fact that most people in the world today cannot name a single king of Aksum, cannot describe what a stele is, and have never heard of the port of Adulis is not evidence that Aksum was not important. It is evidence of how selective the transmission of history has. Nabataeans are one of those civilizations that most people have never heard of, but their achievement was so extraordinary that it deserves to be discussed far more than it is. The Nabataeans were a people who lived in the desert, specifically the area that is now the country of Jordan and the surrounding region. Their capital city was Petra, which you may have seen images of, a city carved directly into rose-red sandstone cliffs, magnificent carved facades marking the entrances to temples, tombs, and civic buildings. The sheer visual beauty of Petra is reason enough to visit, but the engineering under and around it is what makes the Nabataeans genuinely extraordinary. They built a complete water management system in one of the driest, harshest environments on Earth. The desert around Petra does not get much rain. When it does rain, the rain comes in sudden, violent storms that send flash floods crashing through the narrow canyons of the region. These flash floods are dangerous. They can kill people and destroy infrastructure in minutes, and they provide most of the fresh water that falls in the region in any given year. The Nabataeans figured out how to capture almost all of it. They cut channels into the rock faces of the canyon walls to divert the path of flash flood water. They built dams, small stone dams positioned in the right places to slow water down and direct it into collection systems. Carved cisterns sealed underground tanks into the bedrock of the mountain. These cisterns collected the diverted water and held it through the dry months. They built pipes made of ceramic material to carry water from sources to where it was needed. The entire system was designed to capture rainfall that happened in a short period and store enough of it to sustain a city through long dry seasons. At its height, Petra may have housed tens of thousands of people. Sustaining that many people in a desert environment without a nearby river or reliable rainfall is an extraordinary feat. It required constant engineering work, maintaining channels, clearing blockages, managing cistern levels, repairing pipes. The city's survival depended entirely on the proper functioning of this water system. Researchers have studied the Nabataean water system in detail and have found that the efficiency of their design was impressive even by modern standards. The channels were cut at specific angles to maintain water flow without letting it move too fast or too slow. Collection basins were sized appropriately for the volume of water that could be expected from the storm patterns of the region. This was not trial and error. This was calculated engineering. The Nabataeans also developed a distinctive writing style, whose letter forms were later adapted and simplified, contributing to what eventually became modern Arabic script. Their trade network stretched across the Arabian Peninsula and connected to routes reaching India, Egypt, Rome, and beyond. They traded in frankincense, myrrh, spices, textiles, and other luxury goods. They became wealthy enough to build that astonishing city carved into the cliffs. When the Roman Empire eventually absorbed the Nabataean kingdom in the early 2nd century, the water system they built continued to function. The Romans, who were themselves excellent engineers, kept the Nabataean water infrastructure running because it worked. That is the most direct compliment one engineering tradition can give to another. The Nabataeans also left behind something that carries their legacy into the present in an unexpected way. Trading connections stretched across the Arabian Peninsula, and their script, the writing system they used for their language, was adopted and adapted by the Arab communities they traded with. Over centuries, that script evolved, simplified, and eventually became the Arabic script in use today across dozens of countries. Every person who reads or writes in Arabic is using a writing system whose roots go back, at least in part, to the Nabataean merchants of Petra, a civilization that built a city in a desert canyon, mastered water engineering in one of the world's driest environments, ran a continental trading empire, contributed to one of the world's most widely used writing systems. And yet, Nabatea is rarely discussed outside of specialized academic circles. The gap between what the Nabataeans achieved and how little credit they are given is one of the clearest examples of how unevenly the history of human achievement has been distributed in popular awareness. Most people, when they think about ancient civilizations of North America, either think about the Aztec or Maya civilizations in Mexico and Central America, or they assume that North America above the Rio Grande had no major civilizations at all before European contact. This second assumption is completely wrong. Cahokia was a city, a real city with a population that, at its peak around 900 years ago, was roughly 10,000 to 20,000 people. Estimates vary, but even the lower estimate places it as one of the largest cities in the world at the time. For comparison, at the same period, London in England had a population of around 10,000 to 15,000 people. Cahokia was located near what is now the city of East St. Louis in the state of Illinois. It sat at the confluence of several major rivers. The Mississippi, Missouri, and Illinois rivers all came together in that general area, which made it a natural trading hub. People and goods could move through Cahokia from enormous distances in every direction. The most visible legacy of Cahokia today is the mounds. The people who built Cahokia constructed over 100 earthen mounds, large platforms built by moving enormous quantities of dirt by hand, basket by basket, and piling it up into specific shapes and at specific locations across the city. The largest of these, now called Monk's Mound, is the largest prehistoric earthen structure in North America. It covers an area larger than the Great Pyramid of Giza. Its total volume of earth is enormous. On its top, which is as high as a 10-story building, there would have been a large wooden building believed to have been the residence of the city's leader or a major ceremonial structure. But Cahokia was not just mounds, it had a planned layout. Researchers have studied the arrangement of the mounds and other features of the site and found the city was organized around a central open plaza, an open public space at the heart of the city. The main mound sits to the north of this plaza. Other mounds are arranged in patterns that show deliberate positioning. There's also a feature called Woodhenge, a large circle of wooden posts set in the ground, discovered through archaeological excavation. Multiple circles have been found at different parts of the site. Analysis of these post positions has found that some posts align precisely with the sunrise on the spring and fall equinoxes, the 2 days each year when day and night are of equal length. This means the people of Cahokia were observing the sky carefully enough to mark specific astronomical events and then recording those events in permanent structures. This is astronomical knowledge. This is the same kind of thinking that produced Stonehenge in England and the alignment features in the Egyptian pyramids. The trade network connected to Cahokia stretched across huge distances. Objects found at the site include copper from the Great Lakes region over 1,000 miles away, shells from the Gulf of Mexico, and mica from the mountains of what is now North Carolina. This was not a small, isolated community. This was a city connected to a continent-wide exchange of goods and, by extension, of ideas. Cahokia declined sometime around the 13th century. Researchers debate why climate change affecting agriculture, internal social conflict, soil exhaustion from intensive farming, and flooding have all been suggested as factors. But at its height, it was a sophisticated, planned, astronomically aware urban society that most people in the world today have never heard of. What makes the erasure of Cahokia from popular consciousness particularly striking is the physical evidence that remains. Monk's Mound is still there. You can visit it today in a state park in Illinois. You can stand at its base and look up at a structure. That required moving millions of cubic feet of earth by hand, without metal tools, without wheeled carts, without draft animals. Just people carrying baskets of dirt over and over for generations, building something enormous because their society decided it was worth doing. When European settlers first arrived in the Illinois region and saw the mounds, many of them refused to believe that the indigenous people of North America had built them. They invented alternative explanations: a lost tribe, a separate vanished race, anything to avoid concluding that the people already living in North America had built something so impressive. This was not honest confusion. It was a motivated rejection of evidence that conflicted with assumptions about who was and was not capable of great things. The mounds were built by the ancestors of Native American peoples. Full stop. And they represent an achievement that deserves to be taught in every American history classroom with the same level of attention given to the European civilizations that came centuries later. Around 9,000 years ago, in what is now central Turkey, there was a settlement called Çatalhöyük. It was not quite a city in the way we typically use that word, but it was not a village either. It was something in between, and what makes it remarkable is not just its size but what was happening inside it. Çatalhöyük was home to somewhere between 3,500 and 8,000 people at its peak. That is a large number of people to live together at that point in human history. What is unusual is how they lived. There were no streets in Çatalhöyük, none at all. The houses were built pressed right up against each other, sharing walls covering the entire area of the settlement in a dense mass of connected rooms. People entered their homes not through doors on the ground level, but through holes in the roof. They climbed down into their homes using wooden ladders. They moved through the settlement by walking across the rooftops. This is genuinely one of the most unusual urban arrangements ever found anywhere in the world, and it raises fascinating questions about what kind of community designed this and chose to live this way. The houses themselves were well organized. They had designated areas for cooking, hearths positioned to vent smoke out through the roof opening. They had sleeping areas. They had storage. The walls of the homes are plastered and painted, not with crude marks, but with carefully applied designs and, in some cases, elaborate paintings of animals and hunting scenes that show real artistic skill. Here is something else remarkable. The people of Çatalhöyük buried their dead under the floors of their homes. Directly under the floor, under the space where the living people slept and cooked and lived. And the analysis of these skeletons has revealed something fascinating about social equality. When researchers analyzed the bones of hundreds of people buried at the site, looking for signs of difference in diet, disease patterns, and physical stress. The kind of differences that would appear if some people were living much better or much worse than others, They found that the differences were very small. Men and women showed similar patterns of physical labor. There was no clear elite class that was eating much better or working much less than everyone else. There was no king buried with gold treasure. There was no obvious ruling class at all. This was a society of several thousand people living in close quarters with each other, apparently without a strong hierarchy, without a ruler class, and without obvious inequality. That is not a primitive or simple arrangement. That is a social structure that required people to cooperate and resolve conflicts without dominating each other in conditions of extreme physical closeness. For hundreds of years, the settlement existed for well over 1,000 years. The art found at Çatalhöyük is also worth dwelling on. The painted wall images are vivid and energetic, particularly the hunting scenes, which show figures in motion pursuing animals in ways that convey a real sense of movement and excitement. This is not scratch marks on a wall. This is deliberate artistic expression. The people who created it were interested in depicting their world in a way that went beyond pure function. Archaeologists working at the site have also found evidence of symbolic thinking that goes beyond what you might expect. Some of the animal skulls, particularly the skulls of large, dangerous animals like wild bulls and boars, were mounted on the walls of homes or placed in prominent positions within rooms. These were not food scraps. They were displayed intentionally. This suggests that the people of Çatalhöyük attached meaning to certain animals, that they had a symbolic world, a cosmology, a way of understanding the relationship between humans and the natural world that they expressed through the way they arranged their living spaces. There are also small figurines found throughout the site. Human figures, animal figures, and abstract shapes made from clay and stone. We simply do not know exactly what these figurines meant to the people who made them. But the fact that they made them, that they shaped objects from clay with deliberate intention and placed them in their homes tells us the people of Çatalhöyük had an inner life, a sense of meaning, a symbolic world that they expressed through material creation. The settlement at Çatalhöyük lasted for well over 1,000 years. For comparison, the United States has been a country for less than 250 years. To maintain a settlement of several thousand people, living in extreme physical closeness, apparently without kings or rulers, for over 1,000 years, that is an extraordinary social achievement that most modern societies would struggle to replicate. Most people know the name Angkor Wat. It is one of the most photographed buildings in the world, a vast temple complex in Cambodia that appears on the country's national flag. Tourists visit by the millions every year. Very few people know the full scope of the civilization that built it, and even fewer know about the extraordinary water management system that made it possible. The Khmer Empire was based in what is now Cambodia, and it was at its most powerful between roughly the 9th and 15th centuries. At its height, the capital region of Angkor was one of the largest cities on Earth, and recent research using advanced aerial scanning technology has revealed just how large it actually was. For a long time, Angkor was thought to be essentially the temple complex plus some surrounding settlement. But in the past couple of decades, researchers using a technology called LiDAR, which sends laser pulses from aircraft to map the ground surface in detail even through dense jungle vegetation, discovered something that changed everything. Angkor was not just a temple complex. It was a vast, interconnected urban landscape covering hundreds of square kilometers. It had grids of streets, thousands of houses, ponds, canals, and fields, all organized in a pattern that showed deliberate urban planning on a scale that made Angkor one of the largest pre-industrial cities ever discovered anywhere in the world. The population of the greater Angkor region during its peak may have been close to 1 million people. That is, to be clear, genuinely extraordinary. A city of close to 1 million people in 12th century Southeast Asia, built in a tropical region with an agriculture dependent on seasonal monsoon rains, and this is where the water management comes in. The Khmer built a system of canals, reservoirs, and irrigation channels across the entire Angkor region that is breathtaking in its scale. The largest reservoirs, called Baray, were enormous. The western Baray at Angkor is roughly 8 kilometers long and 2 kilometers wide. It held roughly 50 million cubic meters of water. This was not just a water storage facility. The entire system of reservoirs and canals was designed to distribute water across the agricultural land surrounding the city, allowing farmers to grow rice across multiple seasons each year rather than just during the monsoon period. This water management system is what allowed the huge population of Angkor to be. It turned the seasonal monsoon rains into a year-round agricultural resource. It was the infrastructure foundation that made everything else, the temples, the roads, the city, the empire, possible. Recent research has also found that part of Angkor's eventual decline may have been related to problems with this very water system. Planet records preserved in tree ring data from the region show that the 13th and 14th centuries brought a series of prolonged droughts followed by intense monsoons, the kind of extreme variability that would have been very difficult for even the most well-designed water system to handle. There is evidence in the archaeological record of large-scale repairs and modifications to the water infrastructure at Angkor, evidence that the engineers of the time were desperately trying to keep the system functioning under stress. Eventually, they could not keep pace, but the fact that the system handled the needs of close to 1 million people for centuries before that collapse is itself a remarkable testament to the engineering knowledge and organizational capacity of the Khmer. And then there is Angkor Wat itself. The temple that sits at the center of all of this is the largest religious monument ever built by human hands. The structure covers over 400 acres. Its central tower rises over 65 meters into the sky. The outer walls are lined with bas-relief carvings, carved images cut into stone panels that extend for nearly half a mile. These carvings depict scenes from Hindu mythology, from royal history, from the natural world. The level of detail is extraordinary. Faces, clothes, jewelry, poses, all carved with precision and intention by craftspeople who dedicated their careers to the work. Building Angkor Wat required an enormous amount of sandstone. The stone was quarried from a location roughly 40 kilometers away and transported to the site across jungle terrain, across bodies of water, in massive quantities. Researchers estimate that over 5 million tons of sandstone were used in the construction of Angkor Wat alone. Moving that much stone over that distance, shaping it with precision, and assembling it into the structure that stands today required organization, engineering knowledge, logistics planning, and skilled labor at a scale that is genuinely hard to comprehend. What makes Angkor Wat even more impressive is its astronomical alignment. The temple is positioned so that on the spring equinox, the day when day and night are equal, the sun rises directly over the central tower as seen from a specific vantage point in front of the temple. This alignment was not accidental. The people who designed Angkor Wat understood the movements of the sun well enough to position a massive stone structure to capture a specific astronomical moment. This is the same kind of sky knowledge we find in Egypt, in England, in North America. People all over the ancient world were watching the sky carefully and building that knowledge permanently into their greatest structures. The last civilization on this list is one that demolished one of the most persistent myths in Western historical thinking. The myth: sub-Saharan Africa had no significant cities, no organized states, and no major intellectual or economic institutions before European contact. The Mali Empire of West Africa was one of the wealthiest and most sophisticated states in the medieval world. At its peak in the 14th century, it controlled trade routes across the Sahara Desert that connected West Africa to North Africa, and through North Africa to Europe and the Middle East. Gold and salt, two of the most economically important commodities of the medieval world, moved through Mali's territory in enormous quantities. The empire controlled the sources of much of the gold that flowed into the medieval world economy. The most famous ruler of the Mali Empire was a man named Mansa Musa, who reigned in the early 14th century. In 1324, he made a pilgrimage to Mecca, a journey of several thousand miles with a retinue that contemporary Arab chroniclers described as including tens of thousands of people and a train of camels carrying gold. During his journey, he passed through Cairo and distributed gold so freely that he temporarily crashed the price of gold in the Egyptian market, causing an economic disruption that Egyptian traders were still talking about decades later. This is not a legend. This is documented by multiple independent written sources from different Arab chroniclers of the economic impact on Cairo was real and measurable. But the Mali Empire was not just about wealth, it was also about learning. The city of Timbuktu, which was part of the Mali Empire's sphere and later became the center of the successor Songhai Empire, was a major center of Islamic scholarship. At its height in the 15th and 16th centuries, Timbuktu's university, The Angkor Mosque and its associated institutions had enrolled students from across the Islamic world. Scholars came there to study theology, law, mathematics, astronomy, history, and medicine. The most extraordinary physical evidence of Timbuktu's scholarly tradition is the manuscripts. Hundreds of thousands of manuscripts, some estimates reach into the millions, written on paper or vellum, covering every subject from religion to medicine to mathematics to astronomy to history. Many of them written in the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries have been preserved in Timbuktu by families who kept them through generations. Many of these manuscripts are still being cataloged and studied today. Some of them contain mathematical knowledge, astronomical observations, and medical treatments that reveal a level of scholarly sophistication that the conventional image of pre-colonial Africa simply does not accommodate. These manuscripts exist. They are physical objects. They are in libraries and private homes in Timbuktu right now. They represent an intellectual tradition that flourished in West Africa centuries before European contact and continued long after. A tradition that included not just copying imported texts, but producing original scholarship. The Mali Empire eventually fragmented and was succeeded by the Songhai Empire, which inherited much of its structure and continued many of its traditions. The decline of both empires came from a combination of internal succession conflicts, external pressure from Moroccan military expansion in the late 16th century, and shifts in the major trans-Saharan trade routes as European sea trade around Africa began to divert commerce away from the overland routes that had fed the empire's wealth. But the legacy of what was built in that region, the universities, the manuscripts, the trade networks, the scholarly tradition, did not disappear when the empires fell. Manuscripts of Timbuktu survived because ordinary families hid them, protected them, and passed them to their children. In the early 2000s, when Mali was threatened by extremist groups who sought to destroy what they considered heretical texts, local families and scholars undertook a massive operation to secretly move hundreds of thousands of manuscripts out of Timbuktu to safety. These were not professional archivists or government officials. These were ordinary people who understood the value of what they were protecting and risked their safety to preserve it. That act of preservation was not different in spirit from the scholars who originally wrote those manuscripts, or the merchants who funded the university, or the architects who designed the buildings of Timbuktu's great mosques and libraries. It was a continuation of a centuries-long tradition of valuing knowledge enough to protect it at personal cost. What makes the scholarly tradition of Mali and Timbuktu especially important in the context of this video is this. It demolishes the idea, still persistent in some circles, that Africa had no written intellectual tradition before European contact. The manuscripts are dated. Subjects they cover are verifiable. The universities that produce them are documented by travelers and diplomats from outside the region who visited and wrote about what they saw. The evidence is not ambiguous. West Africa had a major center of written scholarship producing original intellectual work for centuries. It just was not included in the history that most of the world was taught. We have been through 10 civilizations, 10 different places, 10 different time periods, 10 different stories, but there is a thread connecting all of them, and it is worth drawing clearly at the end. Every single one of these civilizations was doing something remarkable. Every single one of them was solving difficult problems. Problems of water, of food, of construction, of trade, of governance, of knowledge. With real intelligence and every single one of them, at its peak, was home to hundreds of thousands or millions of people who were not just surviving, but building something lasting. And yet, most of these civilizations are not in the standard history curriculum. Most children grow up learning about Greece and Rome, and maybe Egypt, and are given the impression that everywhere else in the ancient world was a blank space filled with people who had not yet figured things out. This impression is not just wrong, it is a kind of accidental injustice, an erasure of entire chapters of human achievement. The Indus Valley people had drainage and sewage systems before most of the ancient world had figured out what a drain was. The Minoans had flush toilets and indoor plumbing when the civilizations that history textbooks celebrate were still figuring out basic construction. Builders of Göbekli Tepe organized cooperative, skilled, artistic work on a massive scale thousands of years before anyone thought that was possible. The Nabataeans turned a desert canyon into a thriving city by mastering water engineering. The people of Cahokia built a major urban center in the heart of North America with astronomical knowledge and a continental trade network. The Khmer fed close to 1 million people using an irrigation system that took centuries to build and find. The scholars of Timbuktu wrote hundreds of thousands of manuscripts covering mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and theology. These were not lucky accidents. These were not people stumbling onto solutions. These were organized, intelligent, thoughtful human beings applying their minds to the problems of their world and producing solutions that sometimes took our own civilizations centuries to match. The reason these civilizations are not better known is partly about what history chose to record and preserve, partly about which languages later historians could read, partly about what physical evidence survived in different climates and conditions, and partly, in the case of African and pre-Columbian American civilizations, about biases in historical thinking that are only now being fully challenged. The physical evidence does not lie. The drainage pipes are in the ground at Mohenjo-Daro. The water channels are cut into the cliff faces at Petra. The manuscripts are sitting in homes in Timbuktu. The mounds are still there in Illinois. The pillars are still standing at Göbekli Tepe. The story of human intelligence and human achievement is far longer, far richer, and far more geographically spread than most of us were taught. Every part of this planet has been home to people who figured things out, who looked at the problems of their world, solved them in ways that were, given the tools and knowledge available to them, genuinely brilliant. The more we dig, the more we scan, the more we analyze, the more of that story we recover. And every new discovery forces us to raise our estimation of what human beings have always been capable of. History is not a story of gradual progress from simple people to smart people. It is a story of smart people everywhere, in every era, doing their absolute best with what they had. And sometimes, more often than we knew, what they had was more than enough to produce something extraordinary. Think about what connects all 10 of these civilizations across time and geography. They built cities. They managed water. They traded across huge distances. They watched the sky. They wrote things down. They made art. They buried their dead with care. They maintained social order across generations without letting everything fall apart. These are not the behaviors of simple creatures reacting to their environment. These are the behaviors of fully conscious, intelligent, purposeful human minds engaging with the world and trying to make it better for themselves and their children. And here's the final thing worth holding onto. Every single one of these civilizations, despite how advanced they were, eventually came to an end. Climate change ended some of them. Trade route shifts ended others. Internal conflicts, environmental exhaustion, catastrophic natural events. These were the things that actually brought these civilizations down. Not stupidity, not failure to think, not laziness. They were undone by forces that were often simply beyond what any human society, ancient or modern, can fully control. That is a humbling reminder. The same forces that ended the Indus Valley civilization, the same forces that ended Angkor, the same forces that dispersed the people of Cahokia, climate, environment, resource management, are the forces that the world is grappling with right now. Our tools are different, our knowledge is different. But the challenge of building a civilization that lasts, that manages its resources wisely, that keeps its people fed and housed and connected, that challenge has not changed. We are not the first people to face it. And the people who faced it before us in cities built 4,000 and 9,000 and 12,000 years ago deserve to be remembered not as primitives who did not know any better, but as the brilliant, determined, creative human beings they were. They built things that lasted for centuries.